All right, good day, all. We're going to keep going with week 30, day 2 lecture. Let me share screen with you guys. Let's go ahead and do the PowerPoint. Okay, so where we left off yesterday was this little video on quality grading. So let me move me down here. So quality grade measures flavor characteristics, tenderness, juiciness, flavor. Beef, lamb, and veal have these standard quality grades. So prime, choice, select, standard, commercial, utility, cutter, cull, and canner. Basically what you would see at a grocery store would be prime, choice, well, not even prime. They don't have that at grocery stores. Choice, select, standard, commercial, and the things you see down here with utility, cutter, cull, canner, those are typically things that are used for ground beef, pre-cooked meals. So if you've ever seen where they have like the beef stew, like Dinty Moore beef stew or whatever it's called, Dinty Moore beef stew, or the little packets of pre-cooked stew meat at the store, not the raw, but the pre-cooked stuff, that is what these would go towards, where a commercial facility would cook it and sell it pre-cooked. This could be dog food, canned soups, freezer meat, stuff that you find that's already like meals already done. And then pork doesn't really have a quality grade. If they want to hire someone to give them a quality grade, that just costs money. Okay, so with that, with your grades for beef, lamb, and veal, prime is the highest quality meat you could find. It's mainly found in food service. It's by its marbling, like intramuscular fat. So when you pick up the steak, you want to see those specks of white in there. That's called marbling. Cover of firm fat enhances flavor and juiciness. You don't want floppy fat. You want the firm fat in there. That means the cow is pretty much well fed. Small percentage of beef meets these standards. So you're not going to find prime in most grocery stores. Even a lot of restaurants that claim prime meat isn't actually prime. You have to, there's very few that sell prime. Okay, so choice is a very high grade, readily available. This is for food service and consumers, tender, juicy, a little less marbling than prime. Not a very old animal, it's still going to be very tender. And these are pretty much what you'll find at Kroger, Meijer, the steaks, the places, the grocery stores you buy steak will have these items. But you'll see the USDA sticker on there of which particular cut it is. And then most restaurants serve choice. If you've had a restaurant, like if you've had a steak at like Ponderosa or Golden Corral, they will serve a select. So that's what this is. And you can kind of see, this is prime, choice, select. All right, this is the same cut of meat. It doesn't look like it. These are both ribeyes. You see the bone rib right here. That's a ribeye, but it's boneless, and I think that's probably the end cut of the sirloin. So it might be a ribeye from a really old funky animal. So slightly lower grade, suitable for food service, depends on end product. Okay, so it says that. Less marbling overall, and then this could be processed, ground, or canned as well. But this steak right here, you see all this fat. Okay, that's what keeps the steak juicy. They'll age this meat, which we're going to watch in a minute, how they age this. And then when it cooks, the fat melts inside the meat, and that's where the juicy steak comes from. You can see this one, it's got a little less marbling in it. This is just specked, white specks everywhere. So that's a really good cut of steak. This has a little less marbling in it. And then sometimes you'll see these like clear, hard things that looks like a tendon. That's what they call a vein of a steak. So on this one, I don't know if we can zoom in, but you can see on here, it's just completely pink and red. Like there's not a whole lot of fat. There's this fat out here, which is great, but it's not inside that. So that's the difference in the steaks. Then you have these grades. So good, comparable to select for beef, used only for veal and lamb. Standard, commercial, utility, canner, cutter, low grades of beef. These are your, like I said, this is going to be ground up. This is going to be pre-cooked at the store. or sold off and they'll use it for some other, some other thing. You know what I mean? Like you could, if they don't want to pre-cook it, they could sell this off and use it for bases. They could use it for grinding. They could shave it really thin. Like if you ever go to the grocery store and you see the one that says like fajita meat, that's because they had some funky, not funky meat, but stuff with a lot of tendons in it, a lot of sinew, and they probably cut it down into little pieces and labeled it that. Another thing they'll do is they'll brine it or they'll marinate it and sell it marinated. A lot of the steakhouses that sell cheaper steaks will put them in like a salt solution or a papaya solution, stuff to help break down the meat, make it more tender. And it's still a good steak. Like whatever they do with it, it's processed slightly. So like if you go to Golden Corral or even like Texas Roadhouse, I love Texas Roadhouse, but their steaks, I guarantee, are brined somehow, to make them more tender. Utility and cull, lower grades for lamb, standard and utility, lower grades for veal. All right, yield grade measures proportion of edible or usable meat after trimmed of bones or fat. So the yield is, if you have, here's a perfect example just to give you an idea. You buy a carrot, okay? That carrot weighs 1 pound. After you peel it and you cut the ends off and you cut it up into little pieces for your soup or to eat it, you're not gonna have that full pound. The peelings and the ends are gonna weigh like 2 or 3 ounces. And then you're going to have 13 ounces of edible carrot. Okay, that is the yield. So the yield of that is 13 ounces. So lower grades for yield would be ground beef, processed products like I was talking about. And the lowest grade is canning. So that is basically, like I said, that is going to be your canned beef, your stew meat in a can, stuff like that. Stuff they can commercially cook somewhere and make sure it's broken down properly, because a lot of people don't know how to cook those cuts of meat and they'll take it home and just give the store a bad reputation because it won't be edible. All right. Okay, to determine a cooking method for the various cuts of meat, it really depends on where it's located on the animal, its physical composition of muscle tissue, and how the muscle tissue is impacted by heat. So if you have a filet mignon, which is a long tubular piece of meat that barely moves on an animal, so it's tender, why it's called a tenderloin, that can be cooked high heat, doesn't even have to be cooked all the way through because it's very tender. The muscle tissue has never actually been used. Then you get a shank, like a beef shank, which is like the muscle on the lower part of the cow's leg, gets used all the time, multiple muscles on top of each other. Think of your calf muscle on your leg. That's not one big muscle, it's several muscles, which means some might get used more than others. So parts of that thing are going to be chewier. So that's how you figure out how you want to cook something. Cuts of meat, muscle tissue, 75% water, 25% protein, and 5% fat. Muscle fiber network surrounded by connective tissue. So this is a bad example of what one looks like. I didn't put this picture on here, but whenever you see a steak and there's this looks like a white silky screen around it, that would be the connective tissue that holds this thing on. Because all these muscles don't just sit on top of a bone, they connect to the bone. They're usually wrapped, like if you think about what your muscles are, take your arm muscle, there's not just a muscle sitting there, they're connected from your elbow to your shoulder. So all that's removed. Connective tissue can be tough but flavorful, increases with age, increases with exercise, shoulder and flank. I don't know, just stick that on there. So the older the animal gets, you get more tissue, and the more you work out, it gets tougher too. But it has a lot of collagen and stuff in it, which gives you a lot of good flavor. So when you make a stew and you use some of these meats that are very connective, have a lot of connective tissue, are still on the bone, they're going to have a lot of flavor and it's going to make a thick sauce. Whereas you're not going to get that with the steak. Okay. Collagen breaks down moist heat cooking. This is a quick video on braising. And then elastin connects meat to the bone, does not break down during cooking, trim it away. So here's a quick video we can watch on this.
When you braise a tough cut of meat such as lamb shank, brisket, or pork shoulder in a flavorful liquid, you make it fall off the bone tender. We'll do a brown braise. It's called brown because the meat is seared and the veggies are browned before the liquid is added. The first step is to season your meat. We're using lamb shanks. And get your pot nice and hot. You want a heavy-bottomed, deep pot with a lid for braising, like a Dutch oven. Add some oil. Then brown or sear the meat. You want it to be deep dark brown on all sides. Now remove and set aside. Add the vegetables to the Dutch oven. Brown them up. And when they're nice and soft, deglaze with red wine. The acidity helps to balance the richness of the meat and to release those brown bits on the bottom of the pan. Be sure to scrape them up. That's where all the flavor lives. Now place your meat back in the pot. Add stock or water halfway up the sides of the meat you're braising and bring to a boil. Then immediately lower to a simmer. Once it simmers, add in the aromatics your recipe suggests, like bay leaves, juniper, or orange peel. Cover and keep it at a low simmer. Cook on the stovetop or in the oven at 350 degrees. Cooking low and slow gently breaks down the tough meat into something tender and delicious. Check on it occasionally. The liquid level should be the same. Add more if you need to. It will take about 1.5 to 3 hours to become fork tender, depending on the size and cut of the meat you use. When it's just fork tender, it's done. And with just a little effort, you've got amazing results.
All right. Sorry, I was replying to someone. So yeah, that's a quick braise. So that breaks down the collagen, elastin, everything. All right. So that's what you're looking for certain cuts of meat. They did a leg, prime example. Okay, so tender cuts, least amount of exercise, more marbling, tenderloins, and roast. What that means is you have an animal that doesn't graze a lot, veal, stuff like that. Those will be tender cuts because they don't move very much. But if you think about an animal, so you have the front legs, the hind leg, or front legs, and then the hind legs. That's where everything gets moved. If you in the center part of a cow and pig, those muscles don't get used a lot. So like the hanger steaks, the flanks, stuff like that on a cow, they don't move their stomachs a lot. And then across their spine, those muscles, that's where you get your rib eyes and your sirloin and all that stuff towards the back, because that doesn't move. Like they don't shake their hips. You know what I mean? Like that's a muscle, but it's not used for a whole lot. So it's very tender. Processor cuts whole carcass into sections. Beef, you get 4 sections, which are called your primals. Veal, basically a veal is a baby cow that's 1 day to 14 or 15 weeks. Okay. 2 halves cut down the middle. Pale flesh, delicate flavor. It actually looks pink like the veal meat. It's not old, you know, it's pretty much a baby cow. So it's very tender. Processor cuts whole carcass into sections. Pork, you get 2 halves. With pork, there's no other meat in the facility, basically because there's a lot of religious rules with that. So they probably do that, and it's just a different type of animal. Typically, they don't slaughter different types of animals in different buildings to process them. They might at a butcher shop, they'll have different cuts of meat, but they're not slaughtered in the same house. Lamb is under 1 year of age. After 1 year, it's called mutton. Then it has primal cuts as well. And then another thing that I want to cover in this one is aging meat. So butchers typically age meat between 48 and 72 hours. Hang meat during aging, lengthen the muscle fibers, increase tenderness. So you want to stretch it out, okay? Because you got to think, once something's killed, rigor mortis comes in where everything comes back together. So you want to hang it to let it stretch those muscles out and relax. Increased aging time darkens the meat, improves flavor. It's more expensive and it loses moisture, so reduces your yield. So this is the difference. See this piece right here versus that. It's more expensive because you got to think, if you slaughter a cow on day one, break it down, let it age. If you do that on Monday, by Friday, you want to pack that up and send it out to restaurants. If you age it, that means you're going to slaughter all this stuff. Then it's going to sit in your cooler for up to 72 days or however long you want to age it. And you're not making money on that yet. Okay. So let's watch this and I'll go over why.
Today we're going to answer your top 5 questions about dry aged beef. So I've got our dry aging expert here at Certified Angus Beef, Diana Clark, to help me answer some questions you have about dry aging beef. So Diana, the first question is, what is dry aging?
Dry aging is really simple. You're just taking a piece of meat and you're setting it in a cooler at refrigerated temperatures and letting it age in that cooler. So sit there at those refrigerated temperatures for an extended period of time. You're essentially drying out the product. That's dry aging. You're just losing all of that moisture that's within there because muscle itself is made up of 70 to 75% water. So you're evaporating some of that water and condensing that overall beefy flavor.
So I think we should take a look at a couple different pieces so people can really get the feel for what dry aging is.
Yeah, let's show them. Come on. All right, so we're going to get this guy up here. Has the most days on there.
Yeah, it looks a little aged, huh?
Just a tad. And then we're going to go for this one down here. This is the newbie. Just welcoming to the gang. Okay. See these two side by side. So what we have here is a dry age strip that's over 100 days. And then this one just has about 15 days on it. So you can see there's some drastic differences between the two. This one definitely has shrunken in and lost a lot of that moisture. You can feel that surface and it's about as hard as a rock, while this one still has a lot of give and play to it. And that's usually how you can tell whether it's getting to that savory spot, I like to say, because we're working with beef here. So you got to look at these and just see if you're hitting home in the right area. And this guy definitely has that great age on it. You can also tell that we have left the bones in both of these pieces. And that bone is just going to help protect the meat as it's aging, because eventually we're just going to trim all this off to give us the meat itself.
So I think that's a very important point to make, is that what you see on the exterior of this, we cut off before we cook it.
Oh yeah. We want, from a food safety standpoint, we want to make sure that we don't have any of that excess material that's been sitting on the outside. There's some mold growth even on there. We don't want to have that on our product, even though you're going to hit a high heat grill and potentially kill everything that's on there. We just like to be safe. So this will all be removed. And from an eating experience standpoint alone, you don't want to be biting into the steak and taste jerky. You want that to be gone. You just want a meaty substance. So that's why we will remove all of that bone on there and trim off the fat as well.
The next question that people out there have is, does dry aged beef taste better?
Now, that's a very personal question, to be honest, because there are days where I want dry aged beef, I crave it, but then there are other days where I'd rather have a wet aged steak. They both bring so much flavor to the game that you could go great either way. However, dry aged beef is a unique flavor that you really cannot get from any other piece, because it's got that nutty, that beefy aroma to it, and it's something that just lingers in your mouth like nothing else.
Yeah, I'm the same way. Like obviously I eat a lot of beef, but I don't think I could eat the same amount of dry aged beef as I do as a traditional beef. It kind of takes away from some of that specialness that when you do have a dry aged steak as well.
Exactly, and I honestly personally feel that it's because you've condensed all that beefy flavor, because you've lost all that moisture, that now one bite is simply satisfying. You don't need to eat a giant steak, it's just eating little pieces of it, which makes it a great eating experience.
Yeah, and I think it's got that little bit of funkiness, which I like, but not everybody could, eat all the time, and it's very rich, and there's just something about it that I love is like such a great treat.
Oh yeah.
And it's a great experience, especially if you're going out to a steakhouse or something like that. And we're lucky enough to have a piece that's 100 days old. That's something you won't really see all the time, but when you do have a chance, it's a pretty special eating experience.
Yeah, it's worth it. Definitely worth it.
So Di, I know this piece here is pretty special being 100 days old. What do you normally see at steakhouses?
So usually you see about 30 to 40 days at most restaurants. Now we have seen the extreme of 365 days, but that flavor development is pretty perfect at that 40 days, so you don't need to go more than that.
Di, one of the other big questions out there is dry aged beef safe?
Yes, I mean, you've heard it from us. We've got these controls in place. There's parameters that we make sure that we follow. On top of that, we're trimming all of that exterior crust off, and then we usually finish it off in a 400-degree oven. I mean, we're going to make sure that it's a safe product before we give it to anyone.
Our last question we're going to field today is, what is the difference between wet and dry aged beef?
So wet and dry aging, the major difference is one is in a bag and one is outside in open air. That wet aging is still going to have those enzymes in it that help break down the meat to make it more tender. Those are called calpanes. Regardless if it's wet age or dry age, that aging process is essential for tenderness. The dry aging aspect is going to relieve some of that moisture or make it lose that moisture to condense that overall beef flavor. So the dry aging just makes it a more dense piece, but the wet aging still has that added aid and tenderness. So regardless if you're going to have a wet age or dry age experience, they're both going to be great tender products. But if you have the opportunity to try a dry age steak, you should give it a try. It's totally worth it, and you may grow to love it.
So now we're going to take a piece of this 100-day dry aged strip back to the test kitchen and cook it up. Test it side by side to a traditionally wet aged New York strip.
This is going to be good.
Now you've seen what dry aging looks like, and hopefully we've answered some questions. Now I'll season these up and get them on the grill, and we'll compare side by side our 100-day dry aged beef with our traditionally wet aged beef. They're all seasoned, ready for the grill. Now that the steaks have a nice sear on the outside, I want to finish them in the oven because they're pretty thick. Now I do know that dry aged cooks a little faster than a traditionally wet aged steak, so I want to keep a close eye on those dry aged steaks. I closely monitored the temperature of these steaks and pulled them at approximately the same temp, right around 120 degrees, and let them rest to come up to like 125 to 128. So it's right what I'm looking for, kind of at the low end of medium rare, because that's where I like my steak. So now I'll cut into them, and you can see the difference when I do that. So you can see it's really a nicely cooked steak, pretty normal to what you expect from a steak. Now here's one of the dry age. You can see the color's even a little different. It's a little more maroon. And I can even feel when I slice it with a knife, it's slightly more dense. I wouldn't say tough or firm, but it's like it feels more dense when I'm cutting through it with a knife. I'll cut a small slice of each so that I can taste them side by side. I'm going to start with the traditional wet aged beef. It's delicious, tender, good steak flavor, well seasoned, basically everything I want from a traditional New York strip. All right, now let's try a slice of the dry aged. That one's very different. It's very tender. It's really rich. Almost has like a blue cheese kind of flavor to it. Blue cheese, Parmesan, those cheeses, the way they're aged, and again, the mold that tends to grow on them, it changes the structure. It gives it this real depth of flavor that a steak like a dry aged steak has. Well, it's so good, but it's very different. The way I like to explain it to people, if you like a mild cheddar that's still a good cheese, then maybe a traditional wet aged steak is for you. But if you like an aged camembert or a blue cheese or a really like a 5-year-old Parmesan, then you might want to try a dry aged steak. It develops a totally different flavor profile than just a traditionally wet aged steak. So if you like a little bit of funk to your cheeses, then you probably like a little bit of funk on your steak. So we've answered the top 5 questions about dry aged.
All right. So pretty good video. It answers a lot of questions. If you've ever heard of dry aged steaks, a lot of steakhouses do it. A lot of prime steakhouses do it because you don't go there every night. It's a very special occasion type deal. That's why you typically don't find that in every restaurant.
Today we're going to answer your top.
Okay. Cuts of meat, like I said, primal cuts, first separated from the carcass. Fabrication, the butcher will cut up those primal cuts into usable portions. Some random stuff. Okay, so here's your primal. So this is on beef. The round, which has your like roast sirloin, has your strip steaks. Short loin has more strips in it. This will also have the top sirloins in it. The flank, which is your like belly meat. Short plate, ribs. Here's the rib roast, and then you'll have these ribs here, and that'll be your prime rib. Chuck square cut, and then shanks. So, and the brisket's right here. That's usually the breast meat. Veal, very similar, but they cut these into bigger pieces. This is more cut like a lamb. So you have your racks, like the hotel racks, shoulders, necks, legs, sirloin off. So the sirloin's up here and sold separately for your different cuts. Primal cuts of pork. You'll probably recognize the jowls, the cheeks. The Boston butt is actually the shoulder, even though they call it the butt. Trotters, the hawk is cut up and usually smoked for greens and stuff. Spare ribs. Loin is where you get that long tender, the long loin, like pork loin. And then those are baby backs. That's why they call them baby backs, because they're more tender, because babies are tender. Ham, another foot. Okay, lamb, same thing. Sirloin's cut off. You got the legs, loin, hotel rack of lamb. This is where your lamb chops come from. Neck, shoulder, shank. And then retail cuts, depends on how much processing it takes, is the more expensive it is. So if you buy a whole prime rib versus sliced prime rib, it's going to be a little more expensive because you got to pay for that. Butterflying is when you cut meat open, so it's flatter and it cooks faster. And this is trimming a tenderloin. We're not going to do this. You guys are going to cook tenderloin this week, but not trim it. And that's what this is. So you trim away all the silver skin, trim away the extra fat. This is butterflying a piece to open it up and cook it longer. If anybody ever asks you to butterfly your steak at a restaurant, do not do it because it's going to lose a lot of its moisture. Medallions is what we're using this week. That's what these little filet medallions. Noisettes are small round portions of meat. Scallopini, that's what we did with our chicken last week, where you slice it thin. And a mince is strips of meat for sauteing. So also basically fajita meat is what that is. Okay, offal. Those are your organ meats. So hogs, cattle, sheep, sweetbreads, which is your pancreas or thymus glands. Those are the gland meats. They have a lot of vitamins and minerals in them. I love liver. It's good stuff. Game meat, not raised domestically. Some are. These are your game meats. Kosher meat means it complies with Jewish dietary laws. The rabbi so like the priest of the Jewish side, has to visit the slaughterhouse and processing plant. And beef and veal forequarters, some game, it just depends on what they're eating, but they don't eat pork. Purchasing meat, always buy it from a reliable source. That's pretty much what this means. Guidelines for purchasing and receiving cost, see if there's anything you can do in-house that'll save you some money. Freshness, check for freezer burn, anything opened, blood in the boxes, that kind of stuff. Check in to make sure it's what you want. Check sizes of steak. So if you buy whole strip loins, make sure they're decent size. So you're not trying to cut a tiny little steak into these giant pieces. You want uniform loins. Temperature, depends. Store it at 45 or low. Texture must be firm, spring back to the touch. No odor, clean, intact packaging. If you see blood in the box, get rid of it. Color, beef should be bright cherry red. Aged beef is dark. Lamb, and this is vacuum packed beef, is purplish. They put a chemical in there, a gas to keep the oxygen out, so it will have a stank to it when you open it. Lamb, pork, pink, light red. If you see aged meat, a lot of ground beef is the worst. It'll start to turn like gray and blue and all these colors when it starts to bleed out. Anything that smells bad and does not look natural, just get rid of it. Freezer burn, that's what this is. And these are rejections. So if you order meat, and this is steakhouse place, but if you're going to a grocery store, look for this stuff. Make sure the packages aren't open. Make sure there's no ice crystals on it. Make sure it doesn't stink. And then when you store it, make sure you store properly. So chicken on the bottom, all times, all poultry on the bottom, ground meat of any kind, goes on the second shelf. Whole cuts, fish, produce. And cooking, you know, we'll go over this for a while. So, and there's several different ways to cook these things. We've gone through a lot of these between, we've talked already a lot about it, pan searing, grilling, roasting.
Barbecue is one of the oldest cooking methods on the planet.
And we're going to stop with this one because I think we're slowly running out of time. Yeah. So we're going to stop with this one. We'll carry on with our poultry and stuff next week and kind of include this. So finish this and add some chicken to it. All right. So there is day 2 of lecture, and we're going to end that. Goodbye, y'all.